Music is India's beating heart. It keeps alive the soul of this young nation. It's everything from mainstream culture to regional folklore. This is not the story of popular music in India. It's about those unpopular few who rocked out in the face of adversity. My name is Arjun S. Ravi, and I'm one of the unpopular ones. As a former failed musician and a music journalist for over a decade, I've written about and covered our country's independent music scene. I've seen it grow from small beginnings to a legitimate industry that has festivals, tours, and even buses, bringing a new dimension to the sound of India. Through this series, you will see and hear hundreds of stories that fill up this untold chapter in India's history. This is the story of how we got here. Western music has been here longer than Bollywood. It came to India over a century ago through traveling musicians who performed for the ruling elite. Indian Maharajas who traveled abroad and watched operas and minstrels would come back and hire these musicians to perform at hotels and social functions. But by the 1920s, a hot new sound was making its way to our shores. That sound was jazz. I spoke to writer Naresh Fernandez, whose book on Mumbai's jazz history, Taj Mahal Foxtrot, is an insight to the heady days of jazz in India.
Jazz was really the world's first pop. And jazz was born exactly around the time that they invented this new machine called the gramophone that could be mass-produced and take music around the world. So jazz spread around the world because the gramophone spread around the world.
Those days there were no pop and stuff like that. It was all jazz. It was swing jazz, Dixieland jazz, and also a couple of bebop records.
In other parts of the country, jazz spread through railway towns, for instance. So, and there were railway towns everywhere. So there were, I came across, people have written to me, Filipino jazz musicians whose parents were playing in Bihar in the middle of the 1930s.
By independence, jazz had spread to many layers of Indian society. But often, the spread of this music had nothing to do with the musicians themselves. In fact, some of the biggest jazz artists in the world came to India courtesy of political standoff that we weren't even involved in.
In the post-independence era, after the Berlin Wall came up, you know, everybody, both the Soviets and the Americans wanted the world to be on their side. We, of course, saw great value in the ideas of the Soviets. And to reward us, the Soviets would send us the Kirov Ballet and cheap books. The Americans decided pretty early that, by the 50s, that jazz was a good propaganda weapon. Because again, in this divided world, the Americans were treating African Americans pretty badly. So in this bizarre way to try to convince people that actually these marginal African Americans were free and equal citizens of America, they sent bands. These were people you'd only read about, Duke Ellington, Dave Brubeck. People still remember those concerts.
Yeah,
and
we got some great jazz out of it.
Yeah.
It wasn't just Firangs playing jazz in India. Indians were integral members of many jazz groups that had foreign leaders. But soon, we were to have our very own jazz heroes. This is the back page of a Bombay Swing Club brochure from 1948 that lists over 60 bands in the city, all the way from the Alexandra Band to the Zoroastrian Symphonians. Some of India's earliest jazz heroes are listed here. People like Chick Chocolate, who many called India's Louis Armstrong. And soon, we were to have a Louis of our own, courtesy a Nepali musician who settled here in the 1940s. Pushkar Bahadur changed his name to George Banks, and his son Dambar Bahadur is the man we know as Louis Banks.
I come from a musical family. I mean, we go down 6 generations, really. And all that happened, of course, in Nepal, where I come from. But my dad ventured out of Nepal. And then became a jazz musician in Calcutta. This was somewhere in the 30s, I think, yeah. And Dad was part of Steady Weatherford band, 13-piece orchestra, and Dad was the lead trumpet player in that band.
That era of Indian music also saw the birth of the scene's first roadies.
The musicians from the 60s would tell me, among the essential part of any band, even if you were playing at a Sunday dance or a wedding, was for coolies, because they had to carry the piano. So after the gig, then they would put the piano on their heads and go away. In fact, when I interviewed Dave Brubeck, his fundamental memory was that he came to Bombay and he was supposed to play this piano, and they found it got warped in the tropical heat. So he was taken to what he describes as a warehouse, which I think must have been Furtado's. And he played tried this bunch of pianos and said, "This is the one I want." And then suddenly these 4 coolies materialized, put it on their heads, and began to walk to Eros and Brabant Stadium, wherever sort of that was happening, and just completely freaked him out.
If you were to instinctively guess which communities in the country would take to Western music more than others, chances are you guess the Goons and the Anglo-Indians.
There was a very large Anglo-Indian community in Calcutta, and it was largely this community because they had an innate facility for the language, for the English language, and they had a sense of rhythm. So they were the main sort of performers, the musicians and the crooners, as the singers would be called.
When the Portuguese came to Goa, and colonialism in Goa was the longest period of colonialism anywhere on the planet, they didn't give the Goans very much. They didn't bring any industry. They didn't bring any higher education. They brought a few parish schools, and at these parish schools, kids were taught to read, write, and do music. So when Goans needed jobs, they had to go to other places, and they sort of established themselves as musicians of empire.
Most of the Goans is so talented, that they actually made up the band, whether they were trumpeters, whether they were saxophone players.
And they just updated their repertoire to whatever was new. So when it was opera, they played opera. When it was jazz, they played jazz. And then some of them really began to have a feel for jazz, to see in this new music a kind of freedom that really spoke to themselves.
But by the early 1950s, it was becoming more and more difficult to make a living as a jazz musician in India. The post-independence prohibition era had seen the monies for jazz and dance music dry up, and these musicians would have to look elsewhere for work. Enter Bollywood. These musicians brought various international styles to film music, from mambo to swing to even Cuban percussion.
The thing is, many of the performers, the composers of film music had been trained in Hindustani music. And Hindustani music, like Carnatic classical music, is not a harmonized music. And for film music to sound big and full and dramatic, you need many instruments playing at the same time. And these guys knew how to create melodies, but they didn't know how to score for an orchestra. So they would hire these assistants who would help them create these orchestral scores. They would create the introductions and the bridges and all of this. Then they would throw in their own stuff, which could be, a bit of jazz or a bit of Bach or Ellington. And that's really what made Bollywood the crazy kind of music that it is.
Many of these jazz musicians were involved with Bollywood through the decades, but not all of them enjoyed their work in the film industry. Like true indie hipsters, some weren't even aware of Bollywood till it literally reached their doorsteps and swept them away.
Mr. R.D. Burman, who came into Blue Fox and heard me and offered me a film out of nowhere. I mean, I can't understand it actually, how these things happen.
Did you have any film music ambitions at that time?
Not at all. I didn't know who R.D. Burman was. I never saw a Hindi film in my life. Yeah. So it just so happened, the guys in the restaurant said, he's a very famous music director from Bombay. He wants to talk to you. I said, okay. And R.D. Burman also said, I love your piano playing and all that. And I'm making a film where the hero plays the piano. So I was thinking if you could play these piano pieces for me. I said, I've never played for a film and I don't know, how to go about it. He said, don't worry, just come there and play piano. I'll take care of the rest.
Despite many setbacks, India's fascination with jazz continued for decades. But by the 60s, a new sound was taking over the world and becoming the new pop, a sound that changed the course of musical history.
Screaming teenagers are at New York's Kennedy Airport to greet, you guessed it, the Beatles.
4 young men from Liverpool kick-started a new musical revolution. The early 60s saw the birth of beat music, which later evolved into rock and roll. Its upbeat melodies, fresh energy, and structural simplicity created a global craze that jazz, which many thought of as their parents' music, couldn't really compete with.
The funny thing was that sort of beat music had an even more difficult journey in India than jazz, because jazz came during the colonial era when goods and people could move much more easily. It became much more restrictive by the 60s. And so getting a record by the Beatles was much more difficult.
Basically, unless you had an aunt or an uncle who regularly traveled abroad, chances are you had limited access to the latest beat or pop music from the West. For those who didn't have such benefits, their fix of Western music came from radio broadcasts, transmitted all the way from Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon.
Let me tell you, for me, the biggest inspiration all through has been the radio.
And a lot of input came in through Radio Ceylon.
I think the Radio Ceylon, if I'm not mistaken, was hosted by Hubert Poswaiti.
And his voice would drop you into a stupor. But we'd keep alert, just to listen to the last song, which used to go off at 11 o'clock.
There used to be a thing called the Hit Parade, which would play the latest American releases. And that was just the coming in of rock and roll, And I think I heard Elvis Presley for the first time on that.
In 1952, All India Radio stopped broadcasting Hindi film music along with any music featuring the harmonium and even broadcasts of cricket commentary. This was because the then INB minister, B.V. Keskar, an austere Brahmin and classical music purist, thought of the Hindi film music of that time as vulgar, cheap, and even overly westernized. Some things never change, right? This is where Radio Ceylon comes in. It was a station set up by the Ceylonese government as an Asia-wide commercial service. The station had an incredibly popular Hindi service and also broadcast Western music programs with the latest beat and pop music. Apart from Radio Ceylon, other broadcasts from the BBC, Voice of America and the like had a major influence on musicians in India.
We used to listen to BBC World Service quite a lot. And a guy called Dave Lee Travis, he used to have a regular show on World Service. And you'd get it from some transmitter in Ceylon. So it would be that coming and going kind of thing. I thought all music just came and went like that.
What really brought music into focus was like when the British explosion took place.
Jethro Tull, Pink Floyd, Traffic, The Who, Deep Purple, The Beatles, The Rolling Stones, all British bands, tiny little island.
That must have been a shot in the arm for the young people.
Absolutely.
Did you feel that?
It was a craze, just like it was in the West. It happened here, and they captured everyone's heart, spirit, imagination. And every band kind of modeled themselves on the Beatles.
I think the thing why many in my generation might have been Beatles fans was this whole game this whole sort of experimenting with Indian music which the Beatles did. Harrison and Maharishi and all that. That was quite heavily splashed on the papers. So it came to our notice.
What it did was that it helped to banish any sense of an inferiority complex. Because if you're constantly told that, be yourself, don't ape someone else, and then you turn around and said, hey, no one's aping anyone, we're just getting together, we're just getting together. It's like an international jam session. Let's get together,
The Beatles' trip to India fanned the flames of an already growing hippie culture around the world. This would then spiral out of control with the Woodstock Festival in 1969 and the film about it that was released the year after. The documentary was screened in India and often had local bands performing on the theatre stage before the film was played. It even inspired a similar gathering in 1971 in a place called Malavali near Lonavala. Sneha Yatra saw nearly 4,000 young Indian hippies gather together to enjoy rock music played by local groups, discussions on poetry and politics, and more, all under the persistent haze of fresh Maharashtra weed.
That was like, I think, a kind of turning point, you know, that Woodstock, because it was like, what's happening to the world?
That was a whole different scene. And when you're in college, let me tell you, it's very idealistic.
It sort of opened the floodgates of acknowledgement of a force that has now become so popular. It empowered us. It empowered us.
The foundations of rock and roll were slowly being laid in India, and now it was time for bands of our own. The seeds of rock and roll were sown, and soon beat groups would sprout up all over the country. From Calcutta to Cochin, boys and girls were picking up guitars and playing the music they'd heard on the radio. Clubs were filling up for daytime jam sessions and nighttime dances. In Bombay, a bunch of school kids formed the Jets, one of the city's earliest beat groups, who played music by the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and a bunch of other popular bands.
I remember our first show was at St. Xavier's College, and we had no equipment. It was a very primitive scene. The sound system sucked, but the spirit was so strong that nobody cared. Everybody loved it. And I remember so clearly singing a song and my string broke. And I said, oh shit, what do I do? So I just played on with 5 strings and I broke one more and nobody cared. They were just so happy hearing the music.
Bombay City also gave birth to one of the country's earliest all-girl groups, a quartet called the Ladybirds. They won beat competitions, earned their own contracts, and gave the boys a run for their money.
One of my friends was an excellent drummer on the table, and she was so good. So one day we sat and we tried out harmonies, and we found that we hit it off beautifully well. So the girl who played the drums bought herself a drum set. She became a drummer. Her name was Merlin. Then there was Jenny, who played the bass. There was me, who played the lead. And there was Zarina, another classmate of ours. She played the rhythm. And we were known as the Ladybirds.
In Calcutta, a group called Great Bear, which later morphed into a group called Hi, were the hot young band in the city. Their frontman Dilip Balakrishnan, who tragically passed away in 1990, was considered to be one of the most unique voices of his time.
If he had not passed away untimely, he would be in line for Grammys. Nobody has any clue what he has done with the songs of J.R.R. Tolkien. Nobody knows what he did with the song of Gollum. Nobody knows what he did with the song of those trees that moved in Lord of the Rings. You know, the whole forest walked. I'm not having any disrespect whatsoever for anyone, but the way he put melody to those poems in Lord of the Rings, the way he changed them into songs, would take Mr. Rahman another 48 generations.
Another prominent group of the time were the Fen Tones from Ceylon. They played everywhere from tea estates in the northeast to nationwide beat competitions. They played in a DIY era where unique solutions were found for common problems, like not having instruments.
Tell me a little about the tea chest as the way.
Tea chest, you know, to make a kind of a tea chest, they block from all sides. You have a small hole in the middle, and they tie it with string. And one stick this side, they put their leg on top there, and then you adjust the thing.
And you used to get a bass sound out of it?
Good, solid bass sound.
Oh, yeah?
Very bass sound, very heavy.
One of the most unique artists of this era was a young woman in a sari who started singing in nightclubs in Chennai and Calcutta in the 60s and who soon became one of the country's biggest Western music exports.
She was, what,
19 years old, dressed in a sari, singing Ella Fitzgerald number, that people got a little bit of a shock.
I look like the typical girl next door. Even in those days, I looked like this.
But once they heard her, they just... And she's absolutely fantastic for the crowd. She carries the crowd with her wherever she is.
When we talk about it, I think that would be the first, the biggest USP, which has kept me on for so long, is the fact that you never expected what you finally got out of the sari.
Through the decades, musicians playing Western music in India have had an uphill battle, not just to practice their art, but also for recognition. Back in the 60s, most people didn't quite understand this fascination of young people with what they considered to be an erosion of Indian culture. Over the years, musicians playing Western music in India have had to fight this in some form or the other. But it's the efforts of these pioneering heroes that have enabled the scene to get where it is today.